All right, here we are. We're live. Hello, everyone out there. I'm Keith Fasone with the Harvard University Center for Hellenic Studies. Yes, thank you, Sarah, for removing that cover slide. Let's see. Our guest today is Dr. Jackie Murray, who is Associate Professor of Classics, of African American and Africana Studies, and of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Kentucky. She is on the editorial board of Classical Philology, Religion Compass, and Brill's Research Perspectives in Classical Poetry. Her primary research area is Hellenistic poetry, its reception of archaic and classical literature, and its influence then on later Greek and Latin literatures. Her publications have focused, though not exclusively, on Apollonius's Argonautica and Callimachus's Hymn to Demeter, including a forthcoming book that the CHS will publish. And so it's a wonderful opportunity that we have today to talk with you, Jackie, about Apollonius's Argonautica, Earth, Sky, and Sea is the title you gave to this. So thank you for joining us so much. Really appreciate it.
I'm glad to be here. This is really fun. And I love to talk about the Argonautica, so
Perfect.
It's going to be excellent.
So yeah, the floor is yours. And I appreciate you adding your first slide to your presentation so that we can hear how you came to be interested in the classical world for the first time.
Right. So I'm going to turn on let's see if I can share my screen, and then I'll explain the first slide. Let's see here. Share screen. Okay, can you guys see that?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so when I was a child, my father, in order to get us to, stop pulling each other's hair and fighting, said, "There's something on TV for kids. Watch it." And it was the Ray Harryhausen, Jason and the Argonauts, and the skeleton scene where the monsters come out, the skeletons come out of the earth.
Yeah.
Terrified the living daylights out of me. And so I always say that I'm working out that trauma ever since.
Right.
so I've been obsessed with Jason and the Argonauts since I was a kid. And so I've always been attracted to anything ancient. And once I realized, it's an ancient Greek poem, that was that's how I got into it. My first Greek professor actually worked on Antimachus of Colophon, and so we were able to get him to teach us the Argonautica as undergrads, which back in the day you didn't do that. And so that's how I got into it, and that's where my obsession with the Argonautica.
The question is, did your father know what was on?
No, exactly. No. He just knew it was for kids. It was a mythology thing. Kids will be quiet if you watch it. and instead of screaming and running around the house as we were doing.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you. Yeah, that still slide brings back memories of my own.
So do you want me to stop sharing or continue on with
just go ahead and continue on. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So I'll move to the next slide. So my presentation today is entitled Argonautica, Earth, Sky, and Sea. And we were saying at the beginning, just in the chit chat section of this meeting, that what I'm going to try to sort of convince you all of is the premise of my next Argonautica book, not one I'm finishing, but the next one I want to work on, is that the Argonautica can be a calendar poem. Now that's going to take a little bit of work, but I want to show you that there's enough in there to suggest that the poem certainly is linking itself to some kind of universal Greek calendar.
Jackie, before you continue, your slides are a little small. We're not seeing like the full kind of presentation mode somehow. I don't know.
Okay, maybe I can let me go back.
I'll see if that's something I can adjust. But I think it's probably on your end.
You think it's on my end?
I'm guessing.
Okay, let me stop and stop sharing and reshare.
Okay.
Because I do have it.
Yeah, it was working earlier when we tested.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe
I have
what I
high
need to
hopes.
do, make sure that I'm sharing it in the right spot. Okay, so okay, maybe I wasn't sharing it in the right spot. Okay, how about that? Is that any better?
Beautiful. Yes.
That's okay. Yeah, so I wasn't pulling it from the right place.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm gonna so I'm gonna start with the Roman Quintilian in his Institutio Oratoria, where he's advising the young orator what to read in order to be, well-rounded in your speeches. And one of the things he says in terms of dealing with poetry is that the young orator should pay attention to the astronomy in the poetry, because the poets use astronomy to indicate times. They use the constellations to indicate time or times. And also we might even think direction. So we know this already in the Odyssey, when Homer has Odysseus sail back from Calypso's island. He's sailing away from her island, and she gives him instructions on what stars to pay attention to in order to guide his raft back. And so already we know that the Greeks are interested in putting astronomy into the poems, and it has something to do with, certainly with sailing. And indeed, we can figure out what direction Odysseus is going from the description of the constellations. But we can also figure out what time of year, right? So it's very likely that he's, if based on this description, that this is happening in March, right? Because that's when you'll have this set up in the sky. So let's move on. So, well, we're moving to the Argonautica. This seemed pretty obvious that, of course, the stars are going to be a thing. The Argo itself is a constellation, and indeed, it's a constellation located in the Milky Way, right? And if we didn't get that, there's going to be stars involved. I mean, like a lot of, I have to say, there's very few people who actually pay much attention to the stars in the Argonautica, which struck me as odd. But again, I'm more obsessed with the poem than most, perhaps. But so the first simile of the poem is astronomical. Indeed, there are characters in the poem we can think about that are astronomical. There's, of course, the Gemini are members. There's Hercules is a constellation. There's a guy who's a son of a comet. Coronis, son of Cometes. And there's also two guys called Starry, just Asterion and Asterius. So there's quite a bit of star stuff in the catalog of Argonauts. And then the Argonauts themselves are then, in the first simile, are compared to stars. When the people gather around them as they're making their procession to the harbor, they are compared to stars that are prominent in the clouds. And often people compare this, of course, to the astronomical similes that are in Homer, where you do have Hector is like a star that's going in and out of the clouds, etc. Whereas I do think that that's there, that is an allusion. However, what I think he's doing with that allusion is naturalizing it to his own poem, because I think the clouds there in the Homer are, of course, atmospheric clouds, whereas the clouds I think Apollonius is referring to are the nebula, the cloudiness that the Milky Way has. And so if you realize that, yeah, the Argo and many of these characters are actually, in their astronomical iteration, are located in the Milky Way, then that simile starts to make sense, right? Now, what's interesting is, of course, that there's this interesting temporal distortions that happen in the Argonautica, where we, the audience, are located in one location. We're in Egypt, but the action is taking place in the north of us, in the northern Mediterranean and the Black Sea initially, and then coming back down to Libya and in the west. So the action is taking place away from us, and which means then that the Argonauts themselves, when they're marching out to Iolcus, they actually can't see the Argo constellation, because the Argo constellation is a southern constellation that's much more visible in the night sky in Egypt and lower, whereas in the north it's not that visible. So that's interesting. And then of course, well, I mean, it's not a star, not a constellation yet anyway, so it's not there for them to see. Just in general, chronologically, in terms of its existence in the sky, it doesn't exist yet. It's after their voyage, then it will become a star. So, but Apollonius is alluding to that outcome of the Argo as a constellation, and he's all in the language. He's certainly alluding to Aratus's description of the Argo constellation. And of course, we also have Hercules, who is a star, a constellation, and notice he's offset from the Milky Way. And I think that's significant because, of course, he's going to be jettisoned from the whole voyage in general. I think that's there too. And then there's reference in the poem to the Corona Borealis, the Ariadne's crown, which Jason is telling Medea that Ariadne received this crown from the gods. So when she helped Theseus, so you might get something similar, basically. Now, what's interesting is that, as you'll see, as we're working out, I'll show you later, is that when he's telling her this, the sky would have had that crown visible. So it's at the time of year when that would have been, when he's speaking to her, it's actually at the time of year when he would be able to point to it and tell her, there it is, lo and behold. So yeah, so there's a lot of the astronomical references in the Argonautica are realistic, right? They're not just sprinkled in for fun and just for beauty, as we think, oh, we'll just put a couple of stars in the story and the stars are pretty. No, they actually reflect Apollonius's engagement with the contemporary scientific developments of astronomy and astrology and geography and calendrics, etc. that's going on in the Ptolemaic court and in Alexandria at the time, and also Rhodes, what we might even say. So in case we really didn't get it that astronomy is important, then we also have, of course, the very first song that Orpheus, who is the first Argonautic poet, sings, is actually about how the universe came into being. And he starts with earth, sky, and sea. We're all one shape. And then strife separated them. And then after that, the stars, the moon, and the paths of the sun were firmly established in the heavens. So the first thing is establishing the sky, and then we had the land and the sea, and then all the creeping things that came out of the earth. So he's giving us the setup of the cosmos, but again, the stars are all organized. And then there's another reference in book 4 to a time before the current astronomical orientation, which is really, really interesting. And it's when Egypt existed. So somehow Egypt existed in this way back past before there was sun and moon. So there's, again, this temporal distortion tends to be happening where we are outside of the time, in one sense, outside of the time of the poem, but at the same time, we're connected to it. And so the Argonauts then, in terms of, they come from all over this northern part, these Greek communities in the north. And so it's this collective voyage to go and get the fleece and come back. And of course, the fleece, let's not forget, the fleece too is a constellation. It's Aries, right? So that's also worth remembering. And what's interesting is that, okay, they all come from all these different places in Greece. And the thing about, unlike Romans, who had one calendar that everybody kind of worked with, maybe needed to be adjusted all the time, but they did have just one calendar. Greeks did not. And so, it's amazing that they all got there on time. Some of them didn't miss the boat, because, their calendars were all different. They began different month names, began at different times of the year. Their intercalations, because most of them are lunar solar, so their intercalations may have been different. And so how would they get to the same place on time? Well, they would probably all have to use the sky to figure that out, because normally you could say, well, the first full moon after the solstice, we can all make that, right? That kind of thing. So, all right. So we're dealing with a universe where the Greeks don't have a common calendar. That really needs to be stressed. They don't have a common calendar, and they don't really want one, maybe, but they just don't have one. Now, meanwhile, you have the Ptolemaic kings, the Seleucid kings, living or operating or ruling territories that are used to having a common calendar. Egypt has a common calendar. The Seleucids, the Persians had a common calendar. So there was a common calendar. When you're ruling an empire, you want everybody to be on the same calendar. So at the time, there's also interest in synchronizing times and getting the calendars working. So another aspect about the Argonautica, of course, is this global voyage, right? It's all over the world. So it's going to circle the whole world. And that was another, Apollonius drew a lot on the geographical studies that were happening at the time. There's a couple of studies on the geography of the Argonautica. So he's drawing on geography, he's drawing on astronomy, and also issues to do with sailing, etc. So one of the things that is striking that we mentioned again at the beginning in our chit chat section is that how Keith, you were talking about how there's a lot of days. You did a search. You saw, yeah, a lot of days. We don't get years and months and things like that, but we do get days, right? Yeah, lots and lots of days. In fact, it's very reminiscent. You get the sense that so this is the route between the Phasis, from Lemnos to the Phasis. And this is where there's a lot of concentration on the days. We know, we have, and they were here for 3 days, and then they were here for 2 days, and then they stayed there for 20 days. And this constant telling us how much is going on. And in this, I think he is imitating Xenophon in the Anabasis. And it's not accidental that Xenophon actually does cover the same kind of territory on the way back, right? They're going back from Colchis to the sea, the Aegean. And so, you get the impression that just as you can do with Xenophon is figure out what is going on here in terms of how much time has passed and when this is happening, etc., that indeed this is going on here. And I've written an article where I've used this sort of setting up of a calendar of an itinerary, drawing on Villon, the French editors. He already worked this out, drawing on his data to notice that also, in addition to telling us how many days they spend there and etc., he also tells us what astronomical phenomena was happening, right? So, for example, when they arrive at Mysia, where they're going to lose Hercules, right? Hylas is going to get the water, and he attracts the attention of a nymph, mainly because the full moon is shining on him and enhancing his beauty. So there's a full moon in the world there. And then the next morning, we're told that Tiffys, the pilot, rushes everybody to get on board. We got to get going before the winds go a different way, because he sees the morning star come up and he thinks that, okay, we got to get on board. And then what happens is they sail out, and then when the sun comes up, they realize, oh no, we left Hercules behind. And then there's a fight breaks out as to whether or not they should go back. And the Boreads, who are interestingly the north winds, which at this time of year would be operating as the Etesian winds, they prevent everybody from going back to get Hercules. But and so they and the god, of course, then comes out of the sea and tells them, okay, he can't come anyway, so you guys just need to move on. So now we have two astronomical phenomena mentioned in that first, that scene, very important scene, in fact, right? Where you have the full moon and you have Venus as morning star. And later on, as they're approaching Colchis, we're told that Arcturus was rising right before the storm that the Argonauts get into, and the Phrygids, the sons of Phrixus, who are going the opposite direction, get into. The storm is brought on because it's the time of year when Arcturus has risen, right? So the morning rising of Arcturus is supposed to be a stormy season. And so this is Bootes is the constellation that has Arcturus in it. And it's interesting that for the Ptolemaic audience, that beside it is the Coma Berenike, right? So that's another interesting idea. So then there's another astronomical item is when Medea is leaving, running away and going to join the Argonauts at night, and the new moon looks down on her and mocks her, right? So we've got quite a few astronomical events. We've got a full moon, morning star. We've got Bootes rising. Oops, I'm not supposed to go back that. I don't know why I did that. I get to go back. Stay here. Pause it. Okay, it went ahead too far fast. Okay, so yeah, so you have the full moon, morning star, Bootes, and the crescent moon, and we all knew this already. Like the problem with this, in order to figure out, so we can use it, because this kind of patterning can happen all the time, except for the morning star thing. But we already had this kind of information. But the issue was, where are we seeing this from, right? Are we seeing this from the Argonauts, or are we seeing it as the narrator is telling us? And the narrator, normally, Apollonius makes a bizarre statement in, let me see, here it is. Yeah. He makes a bizarre statement in book 3, saying that the stars of the bear had set. Now, this is very bizarre in Greek and Roman poetry, because the issue is that the stars of the bear do not set, right? It is a circumpolar constellation. And that's because geographically it's north, and for us in the north, the bear can't come down. It's a circumpolar constellation. So again, Apollonius is revealing his knowledge of klima, which was the geographers at the time were working with. They knew that, I don't know what, it's doing its own thing here. The geographers at the time knew that that different locations would have different visibility of astronomical phenomena, right? And even Aristotle already knew this too, that if you don't see the star Canopus, the star of the Argo, until you get into Egypt below Rhodes. So they knew this, but in Apollonius' time, it's actually becoming a science of determining what are the clima, what are the different latitudes and longitudes of the sky. So then now the question is, well, where are we then? If we're in a place where, so certainly not up where the Argonauts are, because they're even further north than than they were when we first started, right? Because now they're in the Black Sea. So there's no way the stars of the Bear were setting, right? So we have to be lower down where I think it's this one will work now, right? Yeah, I think this, yeah. So when we're lower down in Alexandria, right, the legs of the Bear set, right? And if you even went further down to Aswan, which is where Eratosthenes did his observations to measure the Earth, of course, even more of the Bear would be setting. So you're clearly in this lower latitude observing the constellation setting. So that now that we have that, though, we can figure out when was the Arcturus rising, right? What time of year did Arcturus rise? Because that will then help us figure out how to figure out what time of day, what time of year we're in, etc. So here we have it. Arcturus, trust me on it, calculations. Arcturus rises on September 23rd. Okay, which is interesting because it means that the Argonauts are in Colchis at the time of the autumnal equinox, the time when you would do plowing, right? And of course, that is precisely what Jason has to do to get the fleece, right? And so let's see here if I can get this to work. Yeah, there's my fancy slides. So that's so we have the crescent moon that Medea was observing. Medea is on the 29th. You have the full moon and the morning star are happening on the 15th of July. And to help with all, so we think, in other words, we can work it back based on all the data of how many days he keeps saying. You go back, and now we know that, okay, they left Lemnos around June 24th, which is in and around the summer solstice. And of course, then they go to Samos to do that ritual, which would have happened around the solstice in the actual ancient historical context. They arrive at Mysia, and there's the full moon, and then they have the boxing match with Amycus under the full moon. That's that first full moon after the solstice. They have a boxing match, which is an Olympic event, right? So there again, the idea of games is there, but so we're starting to be able to, all the events, all the sort of ritualistic events and mythological events that happen, we can now put them onto a calendar, right? We can put them onto, at least in the book 2 we can, because we have some clear attempt at dating. Now, so with that, this sort of setup, I was able to figure out that the poem is not just trying to locate all these things at, within the calendar year, but within a specific calendar year. And my article on called "Anchored in Time" does all the argument. But the point is that, the issue is with this Venus rising as the morning star, because Venus doesn't always rise as the morning star, right? And that's because it doesn't go around, it doesn't go around Earth, it goes around the sun, and it would appear to be, the planets appear to be unpredictable. That's what they're called, planets, to the Greeks. They wandered, they didn't seem to have an obvious pattern. And so what you get is that the possibilities for Venus in July there are four, right? Venus can be in these four zodiacal constellations. It can be in Virgo, Leo, Cancer, and Gemini. Now, the thing is that when it's in Cancer, because that's where the sun is in July, it would be invisible. And if it were in Virgo or Leo, it would be invisible, wouldn't be the morning star because it would rise after the sun. So the only place that it can be in July is actually in Gemini. So that's interesting because now you can narrow down the possible years that the poem is attacking or trying to allude to, years in which on the 15th of July, Venus is in Gemini and there's a full moon, right? And also at this time, the 15th of July is also significantly when the star Sirius would rise in Egypt. So it's a significant day from the, again, in Egyptian perspective, that because the star Sirius, the rising of the star Sirius is the beginning of the inundation season. Okay. So let's see. So we've got this situation here, 3rd century. And so what we're looking for is this Venus in Gemini, which is going to show up. It's Gemini here. And then this little star here is Sirius in its heliacal rising as it's going to go up. And then in the next episode where we have the boxing match, what we have is Tyndareus, the sun, which is Polydeuces, is compared to Venus, right? One of the Gemini is compared to Venus in a situation where in the actual sky above the Argonauts, Venus is in Gemini. Now, what's interesting is that he's being compared to Venus as the evening star, right? So there's, again, this temporal distortion going on in the simile. And indeed, the similes turn out to be having opposite astronomical setup. So when it's the star is when in the actual sky above, the star is rising, it'd be setting, or something like that. There tends to be an opposite situation going on between simile and narrative. But if we stick to the narrative, we also see that Aquarius, that is Hylas, has the full moon at that time, right? So we're looking for this setup where we have that situation. And so what I did was I did this calculation, and you could find out, well, that only 1 year in these are the years that have Venus in Gemini, and these are the two kings, Ptolemy II, and it should be Ptolemy III here, but Ptolemy III, and the moon phase, and then the full moon in July, and then the phase of the moon in September 29, and then you get the only year that works for all of this, all the astronomical points to pin down is 238. And now that is significant because in 238, the Synod of Priests for Ptolemy III produced a calendar, in addition to other things, right? But definitely they introduced a new calendar, and this new calendar was the first that we know of 365 and a quarter day calendar, like our calendar. Only thing is that it wasn't based on the sun, but on the star Sirius, because the star Sirius actually has a very close periodicity as our sun, right? So, and the Egyptians based their calendar, as I said, on Sirius, but they didn't intercalate it to make it always that on the same day we will have, say one Thoth, the first day of the year in Egyptian calendar, will always be the rising of Sirius. They didn't do that precisely because they wanted the gods that were celebrated on each of those festival days to get their chance to be in the sun, or in the Sirius, as it would be. They wanted Sirius to be rising eventually, but so it's like kind of like the Mayan calendar, this big cycle of 1461 years. You go through this big cycle. They called it the Sothic cycle. Whether they actually did it is another thing, but they theoretically they had this idea of the Sothic cycle, and that each festival would then at one point end up being on the rising of Sirius. So but what this calendar does is it stops that. It introduces a leap year every 4 years, and the leap year is going to be the year that, or the leap day that you're adding in. You're going to celebrate the king and his wife, and we're also going to celebrate the king and his wife on this particular day, the day that we're now stopping the calendar. So you can see what's happening is that they're making a calendar where the king and the queen, Euergetes and Berenike, are being worshipped with the star Sirius. And they're also being worshipped with keeping the calendar functional because then whenever you introduce the leap year, that's also their holiday. So this is this calendar that is being introduced, and it was used. Some people suggested that it wasn't, but Chris Bennett in his book Alexandria and the Moon proved that no, it was used in Euergetes' reign, and also into his son's reign as well. So this calendar is basically a dynastic calendar that's being introduced into Egypt, that's going to be celebrating the two monarchs, the king and the queen, in relation to Sirius. So that brings us back to, okay, well, this suggests then that Apollonius is trying to link the Argonautica to that whole propagandistic process, right? By having his own calendar, right? And a calendar that picks up that rising of Sirius day, because as I said, the 15th of July at that time was the day when Sirius would have been rising there. So it would have been the new year. And that's the day we're losing Hercules and we're gaining Gemini. Now, this is interesting because the father, Ptolemy II, was in poetry, especially Theocritus poetry, Callimachus poetry, identified with Hercules, right? And meanwhile, the Euergetes and Berenike identified with the Gemini. The Gemini stars are on her coins. The Dioscuri Piloi are also on her coins. And she changed her birthday so that they have double birthday. So we have papyri records to show that they celebrated their birthday together. So they were presenting as if they were twins, right? So we have at this moment where we're shifting from the father to the son, where we're shifting from Hercules to the new son of Hercules, son of Zeus, that we're going to be more interested in. It's a generational shift. We also have this concentration of full moon, the rising of Sirius, the morning star in Gemini. All that stuff's all happening. So the poem is definitely picking on that ideology there. Okay, and then now the Argonauts. Now in terms of like, well, how Apollonius is playing around with what is known about, like, or the traditional ways of dealing with the stars. So normally we think about, okay, the Pleiades are rising, and that's always often a statement. The Pleiades are rising, and that's when people go sailing, or that's when the girls are bringing the cloak to the Parthenon, etc. Right? Now, what Apollonius doesn't tell us, when the Argonauts set sail, he doesn't say that they set sail with when the Pleiades are rising. So this is why we can't go before Lemnos, really, because we don't know how much time has passed between when they leave Iolcus, because he also doesn't keep track of days either, right? We don't know how long they spend from there to Lemnos, or we don't even know how long they spend on Lemnos. But we do know that they leave on June 24th. So it could be June 24th a year later, but they leave on June 24th. But what's interesting is that they're using spheres. It's clear that they're using spheres. These are Hellenistic spheres. We can there's a Farnese Roman copy, and here's another silver sphere from the 2nd century. So they have these spheres that have the klima, that have the ecliptics, etc., and they can manipulate them. So people are more aware than we are, say, of what if something is rising on the horizon, what's setting on the opposite end, because they can fool around with these spheres to do that. And so what's interesting is Theocritus already did this in his Baby Hercules poem, celebrating the father, Ptolemy II, where in the story you're told that at the beginning of it, when both Hercules and Iphicles are in the crib, and Hera is going to send the snakes to kill them, kill particularly Hercules, you have this idea that the bear was turning around and Orion was setting, right? So that sounds all interesting. But actually, if we look at it, let me get to play here. If we look at it on the other side of the sphere, what's rising? What's rising is Ophiuchus, the constellation of the serpent strangler. So you have in the poem where you're going to talk about baby Hercules strangling the serpent, you have the astronomical allusion, it's more like a cryptic allusion to the rising of Ophiuchus, the serpent strangler, right? So that's kind of clever. I think that's kind of brilliant on Theocritus' part. And let's see what's going on here. Yeah. Okay, it's doing it twice. Okay. And okay, so getting back to the Argonauts, then they are this set of stars that are part of the Argo constellation, and they're in the setup. And what's interesting now is Apollonius, when we lose Hercules again, right? Apollonius makes a reference in the simile, saying that there is this was happening at Hercules is trying to tear out this ore or tree to make an ore, is like the wintry setting of Orion. So if Orion is setting, then Ophiuchus is rising, and vice versa, right? And so what's happening in the simile is an allusion to the Theocritean poem, but what's actually happening in the actual world of the poetry is the opposite. In other words, the serpent strangler is setting now in Apollonius. So again, we're getting rid of Hercules. We're also getting rid of his whole career, because it's at the end of his career in the Argonautica, because he's going to find the apples of the Hesperides, and that's it. And then let's get back to the launching of the stars, the Argo. So Theocritus says in his version that, well, they went when the Pleiades were rising. Okay, nothing too fancy there. We know that that's normal. But what Apollonius does is he says that it's when Chiron came down from the mountain and dipped his feet in the water. And Chiron is Sagittarius. So lo and behold, if we go around the sphere, we see what is setting, but Sagittarius. So so he does have the Argonauts leave when the Pleiades are rising, just that they also leave when Sagittarius is setting. So and I just want to lay this out for you guys to think about. The Argonautica can actually function as a calendar poem. And that's what I'm planning on working on in the book 2. My Argonautica book, my next Argonautica book will be on showing how that works. So I'm happy to take questions. I'll stop sharing. And somebody had a family emergency. I'm so sorry. But yes, I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you. I've switched to gallery view for our Q&A. Well, I'll start off with a question. They don't go to Egypt. Is that
Right.
significant? Because, I mean, you were talking a lot about what was happening in Egypt.
Mhm.
So why don't they go there?
Well, I think that, well, we can't really change the myth that dramatically.
Okay.
Because he's working with the myth that they don't go to Egypt. So I think that's one reason. But also he does mention Egypt in this, as I said, in this place that's that founded Colchis. So Egypt is mentioned as, so it's as they go to Egypt in a sense of going to Colchis, because that there's a lot of attempt to make Colchis a sort of, Egypt in the north in the Argonautica, with the allusion to the founding of Egypt by Sesostris. That happens. The reading, there's a reading. They find a pillar, and it's in hieroglyphics, and Argus, the Phrixid, is able to tell them the map that's on there. And then that's when we get the story about how before the sun and the moon, there was this time when Egypt existed, and that's when Sesostris planted this whole setup here. So Egypt isn't where real Egypt isn't where they go, but the sort of metaphorical northern Egypt is where they go. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
Jackie.
The other Jackie, please go ahead.
I just wanted to ask again about, you're saying from the point of view. So the poem is from the point of view of the narrator, or is it the point of view of the constellation of the Argonavis, is it called, or where that is southern? So in some ways, it's aligning with what you said, that the perspective is from a southern viewpoint. So
right. Yeah, I'll explain that again. So the
it's
story,
so confusing.
yeah, I know. So the story has the Argonauts in the north, right? When all of this stuff is relevant, they're in the north and they're going further north. But the way the narrator is describing the constellations, or more of the stars, it has to be from the perspective of somebody in Egypt. Yeah, so the impression, the implication is that, well, I'm telling you the story that's going on in the north, but right above us is all the stars that I'm talking about, because basically the voyage that they're going through maps on the sky of that voyage is now the same as the sky of the narrator and his audience. So they're in, you see, so he's capturing that year. Yeah.
So I thought my impression was that the constellation is the narrator, because it fits in.
I haven't thought about that.
Yeah.
That's
that
cool
the
idea.
constellation is talking about the other constellations, and how it relates to each other.
Yeah. Yeah. No, but that's an interesting path to pursue. I might think about that, because there is something. Let's think about it, because the narrator is very strange.
Okay.
So, I mean, he's kind of odd. So, or the narrators, because I think there are more than one narrator without us knowing. When we shifted around from different.
Well, there's 3 parts to that constellation. So who knows if they're
they're all
talking to each other. Oh, it's just, my head's gonna burst.
That's probably why everybody avoided dealing with
Yeah.
astronomy. Yeah.
If you could understand this, you probably would have been a great astronaut because you have to do everything like
Yeah,
all
without
around
any
and up
kind
and down.
of tether.
And
Yeah.
like you said, and my head hurts when I think about that stuff. But anyway, okay. So I just wanted to, because that was my perspective that I'm hearing
Mhm.
you, and it's coming in that way from one
Yeah.
possible.
Well, what, yeah, the point I was trying to make was that, yeah, the
Yeah.
narrator and his audience are in the South,
Yeah.
and the stars above them
Yeah.
are what he's describing in the sky
Right.
above
And
the
his
Argonauts.
and works out. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Great.
yeah. Okay, Gail.
Yes, thank you. That was really a fascinating talk. So I just wanted to mention that a group of astronomers and physicists from the University of Patras and the University of Athens, of course, in Greece, both in Greece, had determined around, I think the paper came out in 2012, following an earlier paper in 2008 by a different group, showing that that Odysseus's return to Ithaca coincided with a particular solar eclipse.
Right. Yeah, I read that one.
In October 12,007. What's interesting about their analysis is that these observations were taken from Troy. So they were from the point
Okay.
of view on Earth in Troy, which added more credence to the to the Trojan War, that
Right.
it was actually something that was really happening, and that these astronomy, of course, was so much more important to ancient people because of you couldn't navigate without it. You couldn't travel without it. So it's interesting that Homer's accounts seem to be based in the geographical setting where these stories took place, whereas the Argonautica is not. He's not made, and I don't know if they had a data. I mean, I'm sure he realized that he was writing from the point of view of Alexandria rather than from the point of view of the Black Sea.
Well, see, yeah, but I think he wants to have this sort of time distortion, because there's other work that has been done on time in the Argonautic, a recent book by Tom Phillips on the untimely epic, it's called. I think I have it here somewhere. Yeah, but the point is that those of us who've been studying the poem notice the way he handles time is really interesting. And he definitely, I would say he's also quite maverick in the way he handles time. He has things that should be before, after, and vice versa. So for example, the Theseus, Ariadne, Jason, Medea relationship chronologically, mythochronologically, should be the opposite, because Medea meets Theseus at the beginning of his career, right? And so how is it that he's already done whatever he's doing? When we're told explicitly that he couldn't join the Argonauts because he was already in the underworld. So Apollonius fools around with time in this way, and mainly because they are having these debates about when did the Trojan War happen. Like this is a live question for Apollonius and his contemporaries, right? And what's interesting with the Argonautica is that Apollonius has if you don't remember that the map I kept showing you of the voyage, right? Apollonius just sails right by Troy and doesn't even mention it. Like it doesn't register in his universe as a place, which is crazy, given that he just introduced baby Achilles, to say bye to his father with Chiron. So you would expect him to say, and future, this is no, there's no, so there's an attempt to erase Troy in the Argonautica from the map. Like it literally, like there's no discussion of Troy, and Troy doesn't happen. And at the same time, in his time period, Troy was effectively a Disneyland, right? So he's like denying the Trojan future as it were, from his myth. And that might very well be again related to propaganda, because the Seleucids control the territory there, and that let them have that myth and we'll have ours, right? So but definitely there's something going on with that. But I think the skyscape, as I refer to it, is definitely Alexandrian, but it's not the sky that the Argonauts are actually seeing, right? Or what's not actually above them in terms of the stars and the things going along. So there's a distortion happening there. They can't see the Argo constellation, but the narrator and his audience absolutely can, because in Alexandria you can see it. They're way up in the Black Sea, they can't see that. So yeah, and for them the bear sets, but for the Argonauts it doesn't. So again, in fact, how I discovered that oh my God, that's what I'm missing. It's that this is not aberrant, because I used to think it was aberrant astronomy, because how can you say the bear sets, and but when I was in Jamaica and my friend's daughter wanted me to show her the constellations, and I said, okay, well, let's go on and I'll show you the Big Dipper, and lo and behold, the Big Dipper was below, the part of the Big Dipper was below the horizon. I was like, oh my goodness, that's it. And so I ended that. So we've got, I think,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Did you have more to say? Because
I just was going to say, so mythically, the Argos expedition precedes Troy.
Yes, exactly. But only a generation, according to the Argonauts, because the fathers, they're the fathers of them. And in fact, Achilles is a baby in the Argonautica. So it's not too long from then. So Troy should at least exist.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Indeed, the Argonautica ignores the Iliad, not the Odyssey, but the Iliad. Yeah. Thomas, you're muted, Thomas.
I just realized I was muted.
Yeah.
Some people prefer me that way, but I was just really impressed by the celestial navigation, because with the progression of the stars, and since everything moves, it's not easy trying to figure out where they went, even though they probably did go far from shore.
Right.
It's still very easy to drawing on a bit of family history. An uncle actually hit a block away from the port on Congress Street in Portland, while everybody else who used the same information ended up as far away as Nova Scotia. So it's really not that easy,
right?
to do all these calculations.
Yeah. I think you're right, and because I showed the map with the Argonauts where they all come from. Notice that there's two guys that actually come from halfway. They come from halfway to Colchis. So it's like they don't even know. So they go all the way back to Iolcus, and then they have to go. And then there's other guys that are on the Turkey side of the Aegean, and they come across, right? So yeah, they don't really know where they're going at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, and the positions of the constellations you pointed out is directly related to approximately what year or span of years this actually is referring to. And
yeah. That's what I'm saying, is that the setup, especially with the fact that he mentions the full moon and Venus. The moons by themselves wouldn't do anything to help us pinpoint things, but in combination with the reference to the rising of the morning star, right, that helps you narrow it down to like this particular set of years that are possible. And then you need the full moon on the 15th and then that's only 1 year. And I think the issue with the calendar and whatever they were doing with that may have been to do with the fact that situation happened, that there was rising. Venus in Gemini seems to be a very important phenomenon, and then you have a full moon, and I think it's like, okay, we'll make declarations about our calendar on this day or something like that. And then Apollonius is just using the records of that to put it into the poem. Yeah. Bill?
Hey,
very thoughtful presentation. I've always thought that after they leave Cholchis, the route is rather sketchy. We go up here, we get stuck across, and came back down. So I will avoid that part of it. But is there another part of the story that has sort of the calendar evidence in it?
Well, yeah. So when they get in book 4, it's great. So book 1 and 2 for sure. Book 3, yes, because book 3 is the when they're plowing the field. They're there for 3 days, and so it's the same setup. And that's where the moon reference is at the end in book 4, the beginning of book 4. So they're on Colchis for 3 days. So the setup that was astronomically that we saw when they got there, which is Arcturus rising, and which is around the equinox, but it is the equinox actually. So they're in Colchis at the equinox, and Jason then does what you do at the equinox, which is plow. So that's there, and then Medea sees the moon in book 4, but then things go off the rails, of course, in book 4, and I think partly because you do have the reference to Phaeton falling from the sky, right? And so that's what I always thought was, okay, something is causing, maybe you can't really trust the astronomy because you do have this crazy Phaeton story, right? But I think it's that sort of allows the poet to just give up on telling you how much time is passing, because they are traveling through La La Land, right? And it's like Odysseus world. And so whereas the other part, he's actually charting, like he's showing off. The other thing too is that there's the attitude of the narrator in book 2 is quite different than in all the other books, mainly because he doesn't invoke the muses in book 2, and so he's relying on all of his scientific knowledge. That's where it's the most sort of very rigorous scientific, geographically, ethnographically, astronomically. So he's like throwing all of his, I'm a scholar poet at you in book 2. But when you get to book 4, he's now going to be imitating the Odyssey, right? And there's a lot of debate about whether these places even exist going on among his contemporaries, right? So he's I think he signals that by them almost going off into ocean, and then the fall of Phaeton is referred to. So then they lose that. But then closer to the end, you do get this reference to Bootes again. You get the reference to the plow star again, and again, so that's Bootes again. So we definitely came back around,
right?
So it's a little over a year, maybe 2 years they're traveling. There's been a lot of discussion about it earlier than before I started working on it. They were trying to figure out how long are they traveling. But yeah, so later in book 4 there is this reference. There's a reference to Arcturus again, like Bootes. So you get the sense, okay, there's some kind of comeback to the end. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thanks so much, Jackie. This is fascinating. I should mention, at one point, my first chosen career was astronaut when I was probably about 5 years old. Never made it, but I love this stuff. So an extra thanks from me for telling us all about this. Thanks to everyone out there for watching, and see you next time.